Barack Obama didn't just find himself by accident in a pub with a pint in his hand. That didn't happen. That happened because the industry made certain that it was going to happen.
Welcome to HSE Talking Health and Wellbeing. My name is Noreen Turley and I'm delighted to have Sheila Gilheaney here with me today. Sheila is the CEO of Alcohol Action Ireland. And Sheila, one of the key priorities of the alcohol programme in the HSE is to reduce alcohol harm. And I know that Alcohol Action Ireland is one of the partners to help us do this. So I'd just like to talk to you today a little bit about your role in Alcohol Action Ireland and what you're all about.
Surely. Well, firstly, lovely to be here and thank you very much for the invitation. Our role is really to try and research the policy solutions and the frameworks around which we might help to reduce alcohol harm and then to advocate for those solutions to be implemented in an Irish context. So we would look at countries around the world. We would work very closely with, for example, the WHO and other organisations to try and see, well, what have other countries done? This is not a problem unique to Ireland. What have other countries done and what could maybe we learn from other countries to see about trying to reduce that burden of alcohol harm that we have here in Ireland? And, you know, sometimes when we look at these things, it can seem overwhelming as a problem. It can seem like, oh my God, you know, alcohol-related harm, whether we're talking about admissions to hospital, whether we're talking about assaults in the street, whether we're talking about the 200,000 children who are growing up with alcohol harm in the home, a very hidden but very devastating, you know, trauma that can be there. It can seem overwhelming. But what I actually often take great heart in is looking at other countries and seeing what they did and how they managed to reduce the harms. And what the WHO would say is there's three fundamental ways in which you can turn things around, where you can not exactly turn off the tap, but you can at least reduce the pressure a bit. And they would be controls on pricing, on marketing, and on availability. And when we look at countries that have actually, you know, introduced some of those controls, whether through taxation, whether through bans on alcohol advertising, we see that the level of alcohol use does go down. And with every drop of alcohol use that we have, you see a corresponding drop in the harms that would come from that.
And Sheila, we have so much evidence to show that alcohol use is deeply embedded in the social landscape and in the Irish culture. So I wondered, what would you say about that? Would you say that that's something, when you say drop by drop, we're going to try and improve it? Do you think that that's true, that it's completely embedded and it's going to be so difficult to do, or is that a misconception?
Well, you know, again, I always go back and look at the facts and look at where we were and where we've come from and where we are now. So if you were to go back into the 1960s and 70s, we were drinking about a third less than what we're drinking at the moment. We were drinking, statistically, we were somewhere around 6 litres of pure alcohol per capita. And that's just a convenient way of measuring it. And then there was an explosion of availability under a huge, you know, like where we were getting off licenses, we were getting alcohol being sold in supermarkets, and it was very widely available and it was very cheap as well. It really, really dropped in price. So by the early 2000s, it had gone up. It actually had reached something like about 14 litres per capita. So that was a massive change. But actually, one of the things that I look at that and kind of going, well, you know, if it was 6 back in the 60s and 70s, and now it went up to 14, now we're down, we've dropped down to just under 11. You can see that you can have these changes, and these changes don't happen by accident. They happen because of the environment in which you're in. It's not so much that, you know, we have a culture of drinking. What we have is an environment which is saturated with alcohol marketing, telling us that our culture is about alcohol, is about drinking.
So do you think that we have adapted that picture of the Irish person always in the pub, always drinking, and the marketing has really promoted that? Yeah. I mean, each time we have a worldwide leader come into the country, they always stop at some of our hostilleries.
Yes, indeed. And they are, and those things don't happen by accident. Barack Obama didn't just find himself by accident in a pub with a pint in his hand. That didn't happen. That happened because the industry made certain that it was going to happen. So this is all part of the marketing ploy that's in operation. And, you know, when we're sitting as consumers or people at home or whatever, we're not privy to the machinations that have gone on that ensured that these dignitaries or whoever were somehow, you know, going to be photographed there. But it happens because you have an industry which is, you know, firstly enormously wealthy. You know, these are global enterprises. They make massive profits, and they use those profits, I think, you know, to further enhance their marketing and, you know, everything that goes around that. I mean, here in Ireland, you know, on an annual basis, we're exposed to something like about 115 million euros worth of alcohol advertising. And that's just the straightforward stuff, the stuff that you see, you know, alcohol ads on TV, alcohol ads in your paper or billboards, stuff like that, the stuff that is quantifiable. That doesn't count all the stuff like the sports marketing that you would see in sponsorship and, you know, sponsorship of music festivals or whatever and stuff like that. So there's loads of others. So, you know, we're so used to it. We're so submerged in it that it's normalized for us. And it's kind of a little bit hard to see the wood from the trees. But you take a step back out and you look and see, well, what do other countries do? And there are other countries who have complete bans on alcohol advertising, and they have correspondingly much lower levels of alcohol use.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to ask you about then. What are we actually doing about it? And we all know about the Public Health Alcohol Act, or we've heard about it. So what is it? And what are the different aspects of it? And I know one of them is that we've introduced this year was the minimum unit pricing. Yeah. So tell us a little about minimum unit pricing. Is it working? Is it not working? Do you think it has made a difference or will make a difference?
Okay. So the Act, firstly, just to go back to it, is a series of measures, and it goes back to those things about controls on pricing, on advertising and on availability. And so it's a suite of measures, each of which are quite modest in their own right. But taken as a package, they have an overall aim of reducing alcohol use by about 20%. And we bring it down to what would be known as the OECD average of about 9.1. And that was a target that was set when the measures were first been put together. And we hoped to have reached that by 2020. We haven't. We're not near that. We're about 20% above where we should be. But the measures within that Act are things like minimum unit pricing, which came in this year, but there's also things like restrictions on outdoor advertising. You can't have alcohol ads within 200 metres of a school, and you can't have them on public transport. There's also some restrictions on the availability of alcohol in supermarkets, for example, so that there's now a structural separation. You know, that's not hugely as behind swing doors, you know, that's there, but, you know, something that's, you know, just puts it off a little bit to the side, which is trying to give the message that this is no ordinary product. It's not the same as going in to buy a litre of milk as it is to buy a bottle of wine. It's to try and really make a little bit of a difference. And then so those are things which have come into place, but then there's other aspects of the Act which have not yet been implemented. And they would be things like controls on the content of alcohol advertisements. So at the moment you see an ad, it sells you a myth. It doesn't sell you a product as such. It tells you, have the drink, you know, have a good time, meet the girl, enjoy the music, whatever, stuff like that. When the controls on the content come in, that will be stripped out of it. And so you will have a purely factual thing. This is the name of the product. This is where you can buy it. This is the price of it. Things
so
like
Sheila,
that.
do you think that people, sorry to interrupt you there, but do you think that people realise that alcohol is a drug?
No, they don't.
So they see this lovely picture, they're sold this image of, you know, like you say,
conviviality. Yeah. You know, there's so many different types of ads and they're all targeted to particular audiences. So for somebody like me, for example, you know, at my age, and you see this all the time, like on my phone or whatever, you know, the sorts of ads that I get are very much about, you're a woman, you deserve to have a drink, you've had a tough week, the children, whatever, stuff like this. So you get that kind of thing. It even, I mean, some of it is so, like, gosh, like, let's try and make, you know, gin a pink kind of a thing, you know, and you get this pinkification, you know, of that when we're trying to, you know, move towards different targets. So, you know, every ad is put together in such a way as to appeal to a very, very particular cohort. And it's very clever, you know, it often appeals. I look at these ads and I think, yeah, that does look nice, you know, even with all my, you know, knowledge of this, you know.
What do you say to people that say, well, you know, Alcohol Action Ireland, they're anti-alcohol?
We're certainly not about prohibition. You know, we've never at all said that. What we're saying is we're trying to reduce the level of alcohol harm. And we know that in Ireland, we're drinking in a way that unfortunately leads to a lot of harm. We're the 8th highest binge drinkers in the world. And, you know,
so the evidence is there.
The evidence is there.
I mean, it's just, it's everywhere.
It is absolutely everywhere. I mean, people, you know, you've only got to lift, you go out in the evening, you know, a lot of people feel very uneasy on the streets, you know, that would be the thing. Anybody working in the health service, for example, weekends, particularly in ED departments, you know, they know the pressure that they're put under simply by, you know, that level of falls, accidents, assaults, things that would be there. But we also know there's something like about 1,500 hospital beds are used every single day in relation to alcohol. That's about 13% of our beds. And when we hear about, a crisis in beds, like when we hear that on a daily basis, pressure on beds, but we don't hear that, 1,500 beds are being used every single day.
I can concur with that because it's not so long ago that I did work in A&E. So the alcohol-related injuries and alcohol-related incidences that arrived in A&E, particularly like you say at the weekend, was just incredible.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing when we talk about hospitals and we talk about health and alcohol, I'm not sure if people really, or do you think people really realise that alcohol is a carcinogen?
No, we know, for example, that 1,000 alcohol-related cancers are diagnosed every single year, but actually people's level of knowledge of that is very low. And we would have done polling, and the HSE actually has done very good work on that. And, people have beginning to get a bit of a sense. I think about half of people in a recent survey actually that was done, through the HSE, would have said they've some idea of it, but they don't actually realise that actually any amount of alcohol can cause cancer. They're a little bit inclined to think, oh, well, that would only be if you were drinking very, very heavily. But actually we have evidence now, the WHO would have had a report out at the start of this year, which would show that of those alcohol-related cancers that I mentioned, about half of them arise from what would be called light to moderate alcohol drinking.
Wow.
So about 1 or 2 drinks a day actually, really does increase your level of risk.
If we go back to the Public Health Alcohol Act, and then we look at the licensing laws, and what's happening with that. Can you just explain that a little bit? Because I'm a bit confused. On one hand, we have the minimum unit pricing, and then we're talking about sporting organisations and alcohol. And then we have this licensing law, which to me, but you can explain, Sheila, it's alcohol. You're going to be able to buy alcohol everywhere at any time of the day, 24/7, 365 days a year. I mean, how's that working? I'm confused.
Well, so just to go back to the Alcohol Act, which hasn't been fully implemented. So there's, a number of measures have come into place. For example, the minimum unit pricing that you mentioned, which is really good. And it basically says that alcohol can't be sold beneath a certain price. So basically a standard drink, like a half pint of beer, has to cost at least €1. So that came in last year. We don't have data yet back on, how good that has been. We do know from modelling data that we would expect to see a reduction in things like hospital admissions from alcohol. And there is a little bit of work that has been done on that. And when we have the results of that, I'll be delighted to come back and chat a bit more about that. But as I say, not everything has been introduced. So we also haven't had the broadcast watershed on alcohol advertisements. So basically alcohol ads shouldn't be shown before 9 p.m. on TV. That hasn't been introduced. Alongside that, we have another piece of legislation which is just being introduced at the moment. It's called the Sale of Alcohol Bill. And this is a bill which is about when can alcohol be sold. And this sort of, points to, I would really say there's a policy incoherence across government. So you have the Public Health Alcohol Act, which came out of the Department of Health.
Yes.
The Sale of Alcohol Bill will have come out of the Department of Justice, because that's the department that look after the licensing of alcohol venues. So if a pub wants to sell alcohol, if a place wants to sell alcohol, they have to have a license to do so. And the legislation around that has been in need of updating. There's no doubt about that. There's been a hodgepodge of various acts, and the Sale of Alcohol Bill is trying to pull all that together and streamline it. No problem at all with that. And I totally get that. At the same time as all this streamlining was happening, suddenly there was actually, we'll also increase licensing hours, and we'll say that pubs can now stay open to 12:30, and it can make it easier for you to get an extension so that you can stay open to 2:30, and that nightclubs can stay open till 6 a.m. And also that lots of other venues can quite easily get an alcohol license. So, cinemas, galleries, museums, any sort of place at all that wants to, can much, much more easily get a license to do that.
So on one hand, we have alcohol behind a barrier in the supermarket or whatever. And on the other hand, we're making it available.
Yeah. It's a complete policy contradiction is really what we would be saying there. So this is at the early stage. So it's at a bill stage. This is what we call the general scheme has been published on it. We've certainly been making representations about that to the Oireachtas Committee on Justice and to the Minister for Justice. And, we would hope that public health concern will be heard. And I really do come back to this kind of thing of, there is a difficulty when you have multiple different departments dealing with a particular topic. And so in this case, we're talking about alcohol. We have health, who in my opinion are the people picking up the tab, for other areas, that are there. And we have justice, who are looking at it from a different perspective, I suppose, is really what I would say. That, they're about an administrative process, about what's there. Whereas, from a health kind of thing, we're kind of going, oh my gosh, with our 1,500 beds and all the costs that go with it. And in my opinion, actually, what's really needed is an overarching body that would look at all aspects of alcohol. So again, when I come back to the idea of the restrictions on alcohol advertising, at the moment, there is this broadcast watershed. We're not supposed to see alcohol advertisements, but that hasn't come into play yet. And the reason that we've been given for this is that, this needs consultation with the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland. So there's another body, another government department. And it's kind of like, oh my God, how much consultation do we need? 4 years on and we still haven't got to it. But there's this unwieldy nature of, many different departments having an interest or having some element of, that would come into play.
And do we have evidence then to show that if alcohol is available until 6 a.m. in the morning and is available in all of these venues that have been suggested, that it does cause more harm, or does it just spread out the harm over 24 hours rather than between 2 and 4 when everybody comes out to nightclubs or pubs or whatever? So is there evidence to show that it does make a difference?
There's multiple evidence from multiple different jurisdictions that if you increase licensing hours, you increase the availability, you increase the harm. So I'll just give you 2 examples. In Norway, they would find that for every extra hour of licensing that you would have, you would see a 16% increase in alcohol assaults.
Wow, 16%.
Yeah. In Amsterdam, so there's criminal assaults. So in Amsterdam, they would have found that every extra hour of licensing was leading to something like a 36% increase in alcohol injuries.
Wow.
So we have that, and there's many jurisdictions I could point to. And indeed, we have been making this case that it's very clear it is there. A lot of times people say, oh, well, surely we'll be spreading it out. Actually, we're not spreading it out. We're just increasing it. We're just making more of it. And we can look to actually the UK, for example, who also had extended licensing hours, would have found that all you did was you shifted it into later in the night, and you had more harms occurring at a later night. So you're having even more pressure on policing, on ambulance services, on hospitals.
And is there a time scale for the answer to this whole process? Is there a time scale? How long is it going to take before they make a decision?
Mm-hmm. So where we're at the moment is the bill is at what they call a general scheme. So it's been subject to pre-legislative scrutiny by the Oireachtas Committee, and they're looking at that right now at the moment, and then make a report back. But the Minister for Justice, who introduced this in the first place, Helen McEntee, would have said that she was very keen to have this bill done and dusted by the summer of 2023.
Okay, so it's imminent. I mean, the outcome of it.
It certainly is. Yeah. And the thing is, there's such a push to do it. Whereas when I go back and I look at the Public Health Alcohol Act, it took 3 years to get through the Oireachtas. It was finally passed in 2018. It was the most contested bill in the history of the state. And this is an incredible thing. The most contested bill in the history of state. Took 3 years to get through. Took a long time even to get to bill stage. 3 years to get through Parliament. Was finally adopted, with actually the support of all the main political parties. And that was 2018. And here we are nearly 4.5 years on, and it's not fully implemented. And yet we have this sale of alcohol bill, which is like, oh gosh, we need to get this through in ASAP. And it's just kind of going, the policy mismatch here is very staggering.
Yeah. So Sheila, you did mention earlier that the research has shown that the average person in Ireland aged 15 and over drank 10.8 litres of pure alcohol a year. And that's the equivalent of either 40 bottles of vodka, 113 bottles of wine, or 436 pints of beer. And that's startling.
It is. It's a very large amount. And in fact, it's actually even more than that, because those are average amounts, and 25% of the population don't drink at all. So if you were to look at it solely from the drinker, if you were to take out those, it's actually much greater than that, even those startling figures that's there. But, we're in an environment where that's seen as normal.
Yeah.
And it's only when you take a step away from it, you kind of go, gosh, that's actually quite a lot. If you were to look at our low risk drinking guidelines, which, for Ireland are pitched at about 17 standard drinks for a man, 11 for a woman, which actually I will say that those levels are quite high on an international basis. Anytime, these low risk guidelines have been looked at by any country, they've always come down because with more and more information. But even if we were just to keep it at that level, we would need to be reducing the level at which we drink by at least 35% to bring it down to those low risk drinking guidelines.
God, and that's quite significant amount, isn't it? So you definitely think I'm taken from you that you say the visibility and the marketing of alcohol is causing confusion, and it's really normalizing alcohol. And so when we talk about the marketing of alcohol, and we see alcohol everywhere, we see it in sports grounds at the moment. It's everywhere when we turn on the TV to watch sports. And how does that happen, or was that not part of the alcohol bill to stop things like that?
Yeah. So if we go back actually to 2012, there was a great report that came out basically looking at, how could we try and reduce the alcohol, the level of alcohol harm in the country. And one of the key recommendations within that report was that there should be a complete ban on alcohol sports marketing. And that just didn't make its way through to the final product. What we actually got out of the Alcohol Act was very minimal restrictions. So the restriction that there is around alcohol marketing in relation to sports is that you shouldn't see an alcohol advertisement on the field of play. So that would be literally on the grass, on the green grass, or on the goalposts that would be there. It allows for alcohol still to be advertised all around the hoardings. And what we have actually seen is that even on the field of play, we're seeing alcohol companies put up 0 alcohol brands as we're allowed to advertise, the zero version of it. And, when you look at a brand that has a zero product, the branding is identical to the alcoholic version of it. So I would say that this is, even that very minimal thing is being watered down even further.
And Sheila, I know that we're looking at labelling as well at the moment. And where are we at with that?
So labelling was also a part of the Public Health Alcohol Act. And, again, a fairly modest requirement. So at the moment, when you buy any alcohol drink, there's no statutory thing to tell you what's in it or, how many calories or anything at all like that. What the Alcohol Act does is provides for a label to tell you, firstly, how many calories are in it, how much alcohol is in it in grams, give you a warning about that alcohol is, can cause fatal cancers and that it can cause liver disease, and also a warning about drinking in pregnancy, not to drink in pregnancy, and a link to ask about alcohol as well. So that's very minimal information, it's factual information. It has taken 4 years for these regulations to get from having been passed in Parliament to the actually, let's see what this label will look like. Where we're currently at is that there's an EU process that had to be notified to EU and is now actually also having to be notified to the World Trade Organization. It has been met with what I can only describe as howls of protest from the alcohol industry. And this has been well orchestrated right around the world. And the industry have done this with every single labelling thing that has ever come out. If we look at Australia and New Zealand, they have very recently just passed legislation that basically made regulations that say that it has to be a pregnancy warning on alcohol products there. That took decades, literally decades.
But I suppose because they have introduced it, I suppose it can be done. And that gives you hope that these things can be done, because it seems like a huge mountain to climb in relation to alcohol and all of the legislation. I mean, every single piece of legislation has taken so long. Do you get despondent about the whole thing?
Sometimes I do, but then actually I always try and look and see, well, where else have they done it and what has been done? Yeah. So France, for example, it has the pregnancy warning. USA has it, and Australia and New Zealand have it. Actually, South Korea also have warnings about cancer on products there. So, there is hope for this. And actually, Norway are now looking to see if they want to introduce cancer warnings as that. So Ireland at the moment is leading the field in Europe around the cancer warnings, but other countries are starting to look at it. And I do take great hope and heart from that. And I'll tell you, the other thing I take great heart in is when I see the industry jumping up and down about something, that tells me we must be doing something right here.
Yeah, well, that's true. Actually, that's true. So Sheila, we were talking about sports and sporting events earlier, and the primary focus of a sports venue or a sports club should be the promotion of health and well-being. And I've always assumed that once your children are involved or young people are involved in sports, then they're less likely, you would hope that they're less likely to start drinking at an early age because they're so consumed with their sporting. But I'm not sure if that's a misunderstanding.
Unfortunately, here in Ireland, and the research would show that if you're involved in sporting activity, you're more likely to start drinking at an earlier age. I was quite shocked myself, actually, when I saw the data on this, and there is very good evidence about it. But actually, when we take a step back, it shouldn't surprise us because of the amount of sports marketing that we're exposed to. So just give you one example, we did some research looking at the Six Nations and sort of counting the amount of alcohol references that you would see. So you think you're watching a game of rugby, you're actually seeing an alcohol reference every 15 seconds.
15 seconds?
Mm-hmm. Every 15 seconds there's an alcohol reference, either through, seeing it in an advertisement, through a flash on the screen, every 15 seconds.
So Sheila, on that, because there's so much sponsorship with sport, do you really think that sports can survive without that sponsorship from the alcohol industry? I mean, is that why we're number one in different sports across the world, because of that sponsorship? Or what do you think about that?
Well, I would go back and look and see what we did about tobacco. So it used to be that you would have seen in many sports would have been sponsored by, particular cigarette brands, and that got stripped out. And those sports have continued to thrive, and different countries are able to do it. So we can certainly, reduce, we can certainly take alcohol out of the picture, and those sports will not disintegrate. They will not die. There will be other sponsors will come in to take their place.
Yeah. When we look at the way smoking has reduced in Ireland, I suppose it does give hope for, and we never thought that would happen.
No, and we had, so only maybe like 30 years ago, I think more than 50% of the population would have smoked. We're down to about, I think it's around 16, 17%, would smoke at the moment. And what did they do? They did exactly what the WHO would say are the best buys. They increased the price, they banned the advertising of it, and they reduced the availability of it. So when you go into a shop, you don't see it for sale. It is there for sale. It's not a ban on the product. You can buy it, but it's not in your face in the way that alcohol is.
And that's what we're trying to do around to help reduce alcohol harm in Ireland, is to put all of those things in place as part of the alcohol bill.
It is. And I think, when we look at what works and what doesn't work, industry is always very inclined to say, it's all about personal responsibility. Drink responsibly, for example, or have more education about this. And the reason that they say these things is because they don't work. And we know they don't work. And one of the reasons that they don't work is that, when we look, I mentioned earlier, we had something like about 115 million euros worth of alcohol advertising. If we were to look at the education program, so ask about alcohol and its budget. I think last year was about 67,000 was spent, on the program there. So if even we were to triple that, which would be great, and I would like that, we're not going to come anywhere near the level of exposure to alcohol marketing that you would have. So the only thing you can do there is to severely curtail it. In my opinion, I think we need to ban it, because actually even the very modest curtailments that we've had, the restrictions that we've seen in the Alcohol Act, they've been circumvented. The industry will always find loopholes and ways around it. So just to come back to, one particular example, when we're talking there about zero alcohol products, and industry, I would say, are using them to get around the advertising restrictions. So one of the restrictions is that you shouldn't see alcohol advertising on public transport, on buses. Yet if you go out and you look, there's so many buses, and you will see zero alcohol products being advertised using identical branding to the alcohol thing. Yeah. We see it in the structural separation in shops. So we have this quite modest measure, the alcohol's over here, it's behind swing doors, which are not very high. I mean, you can certainly, any child can see above them, or whatever. But, it is there. But what do we actually see now? We see literally crate loads of zero alcohol products outside, the stone, floor to ceiling, practically using identical branding to the alcohol version.
So there is a big battle ahead of us. And we also have so many different areas of alcohol harm that we can discuss in relation to alcohol and brain injury, alcohol and pregnancy, the impact of alcohol and mental health. So it's just massive. And at the end of the day, alcohol is an addiction and it is a drug. And we need to get that word out there, and we need to, as much as possible, try and prevent alcohol harm to people, the individual and the people around them, and to our communities. I suppose last word to you, Sheila, if you had a magic wand, what would be your number one thing that you would implement as soon as possible.
The restrictions on alcohol advertising is the number one thing, because we are saturated in that, and that prevents us from understanding and seeing the problem as a whole. If we strip that out, we see the product for what it is. In the way that we now look at cigarettes, we kind of go, actually, that's really not a very good product. We're able to see that because we're not saturated with advertisements telling us that it was cool to smoke. We need to do the same for alcohol.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I really enjoyed our discussion today. We've discussed a lot about alcohol and alcohol-related harm, and I think there's a lot more to discuss at a later date. But for now, I'd just like to say to people, if they want to find out more about alcohol and about this area, please go to askaboutalcohol.ie. And thank you very much, Sheila, for joining us today.
Thank you.